Greetings to all lovers of mysticism and secrets. Now we live in our familiar developing world, where everything is stable and unchanging. But has it always been this way? Perhaps our modern life is not an epic of development, and everything we have achieved is just digitization. We are assured that the further back in centuries we look, the more primitive and foolish people we will find. But is that so? Let's figure it out. The world we are used to is already far understood. Or is it? Sometimes we can observe historical events that are completely incomprehensible to us. Today, I want to tell you about things that raise too many questions. There are no answers to them, only general assumptions. And then, I want us to look together at the world around us. Of course, with common sense and simple logic. And at the end of this video, we will try to understand what these artifacts are, where they come from, and why we know so little about our real history. As humans, we have always been burdened by the real past. Humanity has always been interested in eternal questions about who we are and where we come from. But clear answers are not always provided by the scientific world. Things that do not fit into the general historical paradigm are simply not considered in scientific discussions, and discoveries are sometimes outright destroyed. It's amazing, but archaeological artifacts that do not fit into the history of life development on Earth are ignored by science. And overall, looking at the millennia of the past, we simply cannot understand how it was created. But just look at the precision of the processing and the smoothness of the surface. It's almost like a mirror. Unusual traces are found all over the world. But the question of who left them still troubles us to this day. Why, in the 21st century, are we unable to replicate such things? And in ancient times, they managed with just a chisel. Or maybe not a chisel, but technology. Look at these traces left in the rock. Doesn't it remind you of something? And this? These are traces from sawing logs. If we are told that all of this is of natural origin, then let's look at what we ourselves have built with our own hands in our time. Here are 9-story buildings that were a unique architectural discovery just a few decades ago. And here is a whole city in the rock that has been there for thousands of years. The difference in craftsmanship is colossal. Are modern technologies really so primitive now that we cannot even imagine stone processing on such scales? And here, entire mountains have cities carved out of them, with huge halls, majestic columns, and windows. And, on top of that, all of it is at right angles. What size should the technology be? And we just look and think, yes, this is how nature tried. Because we are used to thinking of ancient people as savages. We have been told this since school, that those who lived there, long ago, were slightly smarter than monkeys, lived in caves and forests. But is that so? Very strange artifacts are found all over the world, from the East to America, and strangely enough, Africa. We are told that in Africa and America before Columbus, only wild cannibal tribes lived. What can we say? They still live there. But it is on these continents that many mysterious artifacts are found. But who created them? Locals? Or did a completely different people live in this territory? Or maybe it's all part of the cargo cult. Today, we will try to figure it all out. Today's find is truly unique in its essence. It was first mentioned in the distant 19th century in Colombia. Archaeologists have again discovered inexplicable artifacts found in the burials of Indian leaders. Seeing all this 2 centuries ago, people didn't even suspect what it was and just sent it all to the museum, where these artifacts are still stored to this day. Before figuring out what it is, a plane or strange animal, and where it came from, let's first recall what we know about planes. Who even came up with and realized them? I think everyone will easily say, of course, the Wright brothers. It was the Wright brothers who invented the first plane and managed to lift it into the air. Everyone knows this from school. I also thought so until I started studying this question on my own. It turns out that the first scientific work on airplanes was not by the Wright brothers, but by a certain Sir George Cayley. He started writing about planes as early as 1799, a century before the Wright brothers appeared. And what about Leonardo da Vinci and his concepts of flying machines? They don't talk about him too willingly. Although in the 15th century, he was already creating the first drawings of flying machines on paper. But for some reason, as we know, this technology did not receive further development. And in institutes and schools, they don't talk about it. And in all minds, only one thing stuck: the Wright brothers were the first. But let's go back to the golden artifacts of the pre-Columbian era. Maybe they will clarify something. These figurines, about 5 centimeters in size, were used as chest ornaments in antiquity. But everything can be explained. If we cannot understand what it is and why, then it is just a strange decoration of the Indians. That's what they always said. It is worth understanding that these items are made of gold for a reason. Gold is one of the few materials that is very convenient to work with. The main thing is that it is very durable. After all, it does not oxidize, thanks to which its value has reached our days. But let's look at these figurines more closely. Recall that they are dated to the 5th century BC. What do they remind you of at first glance? Animals, fish, or planes? Wait, what kind of plane before our era? We already know that planes appeared only 1 or 2 centuries ago. So what is this? Of course, everything is as always ambiguous here. Opinions are divided. From a historical point of view, these models are positioned as unusual animals. By the way, that's correct. These artifacts were found long before the creation of the first planes, transferred to the museum, and forgotten. In those times, scientists could not even imagine that similar machines would someday be created and called airplanes. And only in the 20th century, with the development of the aviation industry, did these figurines start to arouse interest. The question arose, should we declare to everyone that this is an ancient analog of an airplane? It's impossible. It would just overturn the entire history. It's better to say that it's an unknown type of animals. And that's what they did. Many find analogies of these artifacts in the prototype of fish or birds. Do they resemble fish? Judge for yourself. Usually, only one model, the most suitable one, is compared to fish, but there are so many of them. The only thing is, they haven't figured out which fish to compare them to. With flying ones or, on the contrary, with catfish. I'll just say this, if there is any resemblance, it's minimal. Can you imagine tribes that live solely by studying the surrounding flora and fauna? Mistaking the species of a caught fish could cost them their lives. And mistaking what they encounter everywhere is simply impossible. They only fish. I think if they wanted to depict a fish, they would have done it more skillfully. But then, maybe it's just a strange depiction of birds. However, in this collection, artifacts depicting birds in a more familiar way were also found. Looking at them, the appearance of a bird with a beak, familiar wings, and horizontal plumage is immediately clear. Now, what about this artifact? It doesn't look like fish scales or bird feathers. Here we come to the main mystery. In these models, there is a clearly defined keel or vertical plumage, which is not characteristic of birds. The analogy is only traced in modern aircraft. A zoologist carefully studied the figures of an unknown shape and concluded, it is by no means amorphous, and there are no similar animals in the natural world. Interestingly, almost all figures, despite their resemblance to airplanes, also have features of animals, eyes and mouths. That's why they were classified as zoomorphic. Or maybe the Incas were just trying to depict a mechanism or animal flying over them. But it still looks more like a mechanized device than a biological species. After all, we have previously encountered images of unfamiliar things resembling mechanisms from the past. Maybe they were just trying to depict what they saw, not knowing the principles of operation. Even today, we can encounter something similar. And the natives are just trying to replicate what they saw. Here are some notes from soldiers who visited these areas. During World War II, Americans built an airstrip on an Indonesian island. The local tribe, which was at a primitive level at that time, was hired by the Americans for food. They cleaned, carried boxes. In return, Americans gave the tribe canned food. When the war ended, the airport was dismantled, and Americans left the island. 20 years later, scientists came to study the island. The local tribe built a copy of an airplane from branches and straw on the site of the airstrip and ran around it, falling to their knees. Yes, and this is the 21st century. In one place, they designed fighters, and in another part of the continent, they just recreate them in the image, just like in ancient times. But where could the Incas see something similar to an airplane? Long ago, before our era, where could they see anything like that? The amazing realism of these artifacts is striking. How could they understand the concept of aerodynamics and wing design? And tail feathers? All this in that primitive civilization that used bronze tools and still lived in huts. And you know what's interesting? After this artifact was exhibited at the Gold of Pre-Columbian America exhibition, it immediately attracted the attention of American aircraft designers. Not for nothing, right? By agreement with the exhibition management, they were allowed to study the ancient little airplane in an aerodynamic tunnel. Surprisingly, the analog of this small brooch officially had quite good aerodynamic properties. But they went further and decided to create an analog prototype, but on a larger scale. And in 1996, German model aircraft enthusiasts practically proved that the hypothesis of models of flying vehicles depicted as mysterious animals has a right to exist. These two model aircraft enthusiasts created nearly exact, maintaining all proportions and shapes, 16 times larger replicas, adding only a radio-controlled engine. The plane took off. This sensation was immediately hushed up. The news did not receive further explanations from the official position. It remains interesting that soon the bureau that took these planes for study introduced some of these constructions into its production. Delta wings, a low vertical tailplane, all of this moved into the Aircraft Design Bureau of the Lockheed Company, which then created the world's best plane at that time. But did aircraft designers live in ancient times? Not to mention precise jewelers capable of depicting everything in such a small brooch. But is it a brooch? Weren't there some very strange ornaments before, right? But in the same museum where these airplanes are now kept, there are actually many unique artifacts. Also made of gold, also from ancient times. See for yourself, concentric wheels similar to those we use today. They look like small models of various transmission systems. There are gears and spindles with teeth and without. What's very interesting is that there are even analogs to modern coils that we use everywhere for electricity. But where did such ornaments come from in the distant millennium before our era? Odd. The size of this ornament is 30 to 40 centimeters. Apparently, it was worn on the chest. But what is that axis in the center for? Why is it needed? Could it be just to tie and wear it around the neck? That's nonsense. However, in the same museum, there are the oldest beads, Inca period beads. They don't look like beads at all. They look like small rings fused together. And this photo? Here you can immediately see they are hexagonal nuts. What explanations does science give for these findings, do you think? Scientists believe that these are all intricate decorations. Well, yes. Only it doesn't look like decorations at all. Decorations, in my opinion, should be, at a minimum, beautiful. After all, that's the main value of these items. Look for yourself, maybe they just have a different view of aesthetics. Or maybe these are just parts of mechanisms, analogs of ancient technical components. So, if there were flying devices in ancient times, there must be advanced infrastructure, airstrips. Well, or at least runways for takeoffs and landings, because the plane has to take off from somewhere, right? But where were they in ancient times? And what if I tell you that these runways existed? And even more, they exist to this day. It's just that now, looking at some things, we are unable to understand their real purpose. In modern-day Peru, where the mighty Inca Empire once existed, on the high plateau of Nazca, there is a mysterious red desert. On this flat as a table plateau, back in the 1930s, pilots discovered dozens of smooth rock surface areas resembling concrete roads. Their length ranged from a few hundred meters to several kilometers. Quite reminiscent of modern airport runways, isn't it? Sometimes, near such quarries, you can even find traces of ancient technology. I will soon release a separate video on this topic. Subscribe not to miss it. Just take a look at the top, which looks like it's been sawed off. Perhaps these runways were intended for transporting mined minerals. Anything is possible. By the way, similar runways are found not only in South America but also in Africa. Why would they be there? There's just sand there. But don't rush. In Egyptian museums, there are hieroglyphs clearly showing airplanes and helicopters. I think you've seen these sensational photos. But what if I tell you that this is intentional confusion, deceiving people, a common practice that is beneficial to someone? Mixing truth and lies into one pile. Manipulating facts so that we cannot simply understand what is true and what is deliberate misinformation and deceit. It seems like a sensation, strange airplanes, helicopters, and ancient Egyptian pyramids. And this fragment was deliberately popularized to create false interest and simply divert attention. After all hieroglyphs are just superimposed on each other. Yes, it's not a sensation at all, neither an airplane nor a helicopter. These are just hieroglyphs, on top of which new ones were written. See these helicopters and tanks? Here's the original inscription. This practice is very relevant for the ancient world. After all, somewhere you have to write, convey information. With the change of ruler, Pharaoh, adding more and more symbols. So it's worth looking at the things around us from different angles. Because sometimes, at first glance, we are unable to assess all the scales and distinguish truth from falsehood. And yet, our history is much more interesting than how it is presented to us. Share this video with your close ones so that they know the truth, and don't forget to subscribe. After all, many more fascinating studies await us. See you in the new videos.